Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Lisa Peschel. I am a senior lecturer in the School of Arts and Creative Technologies at the University of York, and I'm joined today by several guests who you'll all be hearing from in just a moment. I'll introduce them in a moment, but just a few housekeeping things first. I'll introduce this project, Remaking Theater from a Jewish Ghetto, for about 15 minutes. And then for 30 minutes, we'll have various questions posed to our panelists. So again, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the book launch for the edited volume, A Holocaust Cabaret. And we're very, very pleased to have this book finally out in the world. We had three main aims in creating it. One was to preserve the scripts, the theatrical scripts that we created during the project that we're going to tell you about in just a moment. The other is to preserve the process of creation and the things we discovered in the rehearsal room. Any of you out there listening who've done any kind of theater, I'm sure you know some of the most amazing things don't make it into the performance. They're the discoveries that you make in the rehearsal room. And the third aim was to preserve the many voices of the contributors. We had so many outstanding people working with us on each team, so I'll introduce you to them. And just to say, this link will also be shared with you in the chat. If you do wish to order the book, please do take advantage of the discount code. All right, so this is our team in Australia at the University of Sydney. For the sake of time, I won't introduce everybody, just a few key people and those who are with us today. We have the incredible privilege of having a survivor of the Theresienstadt Ghetto advise us in the Australian team. So Edith Sheldon is the survivor who's sitting in the center. Directly to her left is Joseph Toltz, our producer, and directly behind Edith is Ian Maxwell, Dr. Ian Maxwell, who was our director. And to Ian's left is Kevin Hunt. I believe he's also going to join us today. You can also see pictured here many of the actors and musicians. There are also several students in the photo who were taught by Laura Ginters, who is not in the photo, but she has joined us here today. And we'll hear about her work with the students in a few moments. Our South African team at Stellenbosch University, we were hosted by Petrus Dupreez, who unfortunately was not able to join us today. The director of the project there was Dr. Imelda Brand, who is the third from the left here. You'll be seeing her in a few minutes. She's here with us, and 9 of her student actors, and at least one of those students has joined us today. The music director, Leonora Bredekamp, is also with us today. She directed a small ensemble of student and professional musicians. So this project was possible because a group of 7 colleagues, including myself and Joseph, applied for a large grant from the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. The grant was called Performing the Jewish Archive, and the purpose of this grant was to bring back works by Jewish artists who had been affected in some way, mostly due to World War II, who had had their creative careers interrupted, and try to bring those works back to the stage. The centerpiece of that project was a set of international festivals. Those festivals happen in 5 different countries, in the US, the UK, the Czech Republic, and then in 2017, our festivals were in South Africa and Australia. And in all of those festivals, again, we had the fantastic privilege of working with local teams and local organizations to bring these works back to the stage. So the reason that one of the festivals was located in the Czech Republic is that several of us were doing research on the cultural life of the Theresienstadt Ghetto. I'm going to be very brief here, just for reasons of time, but you can find more information on the website of the US Holocaust Memorial Museum. There's an excellent article about Theresienstadt. It's called Theresienstadt in German. It's called Terezín in Czech, and I will often call it Terezín because the Czech-speaking survivors that we worked with mostly call it Terezín. Terezín had a few functions in the Nazi program for the destruction of the European Jews. One of them was as a transit camp. This is a place where Jews from several European countries mainly from Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Germany, were gathered before then they were sent on to other slave labor camps and death camps. And you can see on the map, the bottom arrow, the vast majority went to Auschwitz, where most lost their lives. Not all, but most. The key thing about these outgoing transports from the ghetto is that the prisoners did not know the destination. The Nazis kept this carefully concealed in order to prevent possible uprisings if people knew they were heading to their deaths. So the prisoners thought they might be going to another ghetto, they might be going to build another camp, but mainly they were afraid of the transports as a journey into the unknown. Another function of the ghetto later in the war was as a model ghetto. A committee of the International Red Cross was actually allowed to visit the ghetto in June of 1944. The caption on this slide is unfortunately wrong. It should be June 1944. And they were able to tour a very carefully prepared path through the ghetto. That path included a few visits to cultural events, including the children's opera Brundibar. That script and music have been preserved, and it is actually staged quite frequently today, especially in the US and in Germany. But the key thing I want to emphasize about the cultural life is, even though it was exploited by the Nazis, it was mainly run by the prisoners for the prisoners, and they had an intense sense of ownership and pride in the cultural life. One of the things that I was able to do during my research is collect 12 scripts that were written by the prisoners that had not previously been discovered, and published this book called Performing Captivity, Performing Escape. And that's recently come back into print. So you can see the link to that down in the slides. But one of the works in that book, Joseph Toltz and I were fascinated by, and he'll talk a little bit more about this when I present a question to him. But this work was called Prince Bedliegend, and it was performed in the ghetto in 1943. The script was not preserved, but due to the artifacts I'll talk about in a moment, we knew that it was a satirical musical review with fairy tale characters like the king, the princess, the prince, the wizard. And we knew that it was created by a troupe of four. There was a central group of four creative people who originated the play: Joseph Lustig, Jiří Spitz, Otto Neumann, and František Kovanec. That's the German and Czech language spelling of his name there. He was the lyricist, and he's the one that we actually have a photo of. He did not survive, but this is a photograph of his wedding from October 1941, already during the Nazi occupation. So what did we have? We didn't have the full script, but we had three important things. One is we had a souvenir poster. There's actually quite a large collection of these full color posters that were created by artists in the ghetto to commemorate the performance of some of the shows. And one that we had was of Prince Bedliegend. Fortunately, that poster lists everybody who was involved in the show. And this central block here names all the actors and the roles that they played. So that's how we knew there's a magician, there's the Minister of Finance, there's a crying girl is one of the rows. If you look at that item, it's the third from the bottom in the second block of text, the Placici Slechna, the crying girl. Zdenka Fatlova survived and eventually moved to London. And her testimony and the testimony of a handful of other survivors who remember the production, either as actors or spectators, also gave us clues to certain key moments in the performance. We knew about a few of the events because survivors had narrated those in their post-war testimony. The third thing we had, as you see in this close-up of the poster, the author, the texts, Výprava and kostýmy, that's design and costumes. Hudba is music. The music is by Jaroslav Ježek. Jaroslav Ježek is not a prisoner in the ghetto. Jaroslav Ježek was one of the best-known composers of the 1930s, and he worked with a theater called the Liberated Theater of Jiří Voskovec and Jan Verek. It's hard to overstate just how popular this theater was and just how beloved the songs from their shows were. So what prisoner František Kovanec did was he wrote Terezín-specific lyrics and then set them to Ježek's melodies, which all the prisoners knew. So, based on this collection of artifacts, I prepared a very sketchy plot outline. And then when I arrived in Australia, the Australian team and I sat down and we, mainly with Ian and Joseph, we created a much more detailed plot outline for the actors to work from. But just briefly, I'll tell you a few of the important plot points, and then I'd like to show you clips, a short clip from each of the performances. So the first thing that happens in the show, and we knew this because one of the songs was called Overture to Prince Bedliegen. There's a jazz song where the prince arrives in the ghetto. The next thing that happens, an evil wizard puts a spell on the prince that makes him bedliegend. That's the German word for bedridden. So the prince cannot get out of his bed. The king, the leader of the ghetto, the Jewish leader of the ghetto, I should add, offers a reward to whomever can cure the prince, the hand of the princess in marriage. Now, the scene we're going to look at is when an outgoing transport is announced. And keep in mind, the prisoners are all afraid of these transports, but they don't know where they're going. The prince is exempt because he is bedliegend. The fact that he is ill means that he will not be sent out on the transport. However, somebody has to go in his place. And the song that happens at this point is called My Suitcase and Me, which František Kovenec set to a melody called Svět na ruby. And if you'd like to hear the original 1930s melody, you can find it just by looking up that title and then Jaroslav Ježek. But let's take a look at the version that was performed in Australia. So the setting was in the ghetto hospital. The characters of the king, the prince, and Hocus and Pocus, they're kind of trickster clown figures who move throughout the ghetto, officially of low status, but really controlling a lot of the action. They're all exempt for various reasons, but the hospital orderly, played by Nigel Kellaway, is the only one with no protection from the transport. So let's hear a brief excerpt from that scene.
But he can't go, he's still sick.
Well, someone will have to go in his place.
Off you go then.
Food service, I've got protection.
I'm sick, I'm bedridden.
Oh, well, I'm the king.
Number not a name, in skin covering a frame, in weather foul or care, delivered here or there. That's my suitcase and that's me.
Let's take a look at the same moment from the South African production. Again, the setting is in the hospital. The characters are the same, Hocus and Pocus. The trickster figures are pictured there on the left. The prince, the princess, the king, and the ministers all declare themselves exempt. But then they all realize that the hospital orderly, who we see in the photo, Angelique Coleman played this role in 2017. Elmarie Johnson is playing it in the video, which you'll see from 2018. She has no protection.
500 able-bodied men have to go out on transport.
And your name is on the list.
But I'm bedliegend.
I'm the princess. I'm the king. Now I'm the minister of health. The minister of food. We're protected. I'm the messenger.
You can't shoot the messenger.
But I'm not protected.
Where's this one going?
Well, it could be going to someplace better.
Probably someplace worse.
It doesn't say.
Just a number, not a name. Thin skin covering a frame. In weather foul or fair, delivered here and there.
That's my suitcase and that's me.
Used to very frequent blows, inspected by cold hands unknown. Packed up and then we're shipped off again.
That's my suitcase.
And that's me. What could be inside, packed in that thin hide?
Maybe all that's left are memories. Happy memories of better times.
Just like what remains in me.
Maybe there's a prayer in the corner there. Maybe one lost crust of bread. Maybe hopes to start anew somewhere, like those going through my head.
Right. So as you've seen, these were two scenes from the same point in the play, but there's a very different feel to each. The Australian version, partly due to accidents of casting, ended up picking up a very vividly portrayed theme from the ghetto itself of the older prisoners protecting the younger prisoners. The actor playing the prince was quite a bit younger than the actors playing the other roles. So it was very much focused on something that did actually happen in Terezin. There was a great deal of effort put into trying to get the young people through the war. In South Africa, the story of Terezin, while the cast followed that absolutely historically accurately, inevitably integrated questions of race, power, and humor, clowning, both in Terezin and South Africa. So the book itself, A Holocaust Cabaret, includes prefaces and an introduction where we talk about the history of the project and of the ghetto itself. We have 8 chapters on the creation of both of the performances from several different points of view. And some of those are actually transcribed conversations to integrate even more of the participants into the book. And then we have both of the scripts, including photos from the performances. So at this point, I would like to present some questions to our Australian and South African creators who've joined us, and I'm going to stop sharing my slides. So, Joseph Toltz, it is my pleasure to ask you. So you and I started talking about this years before this actually hit the stage. Let me ask you, of all the works that were in the edited volume of these plays that were preserved from the ghetto, what drew you to this work in particular?
A good question. When did you publish this book? Here it is.
The original Czech and German language version came out, yes, in 2008.
2008. So I bought it because I was doing my interviews with Holocaust survivors, and I was very interested. There was a lot of Czech survivors in Sydney, Australia, and there was one particular Czech survivor who actually knew and survived the war with Jerzy Spitz, and that was a guy called Jaroslav Wind, who's a good friend of mine who's passed away since, and he sang me one of the songs from Prince Bedligend. Now, I don't think he attended the cabaret that much. I mean, he was 18 or 19 years old, so I don't think he attended it in Terezin. But I think that, and he said that he learned this song from Spitz when he was in Gleiwitz, in the Auschwitz sub-camp, when they were both together there as labourers. So apparently Spitz actually put some of these songs on as entertainment on a Sunday afternoon during the time off. And the song that he sang to me, which took me a long time to decipher because I love Jerry, but he didn't have a great voice and he couldn't carry a tune particularly well. But he sang me the song The Louse and the Flea, which is the only song I think that was not included in the Prince Becklegend because it didn't fit into the dialogue so much. But it fitted well into Jerry's story because it was talking about the sort of the tension that arose in the Jewish population between people who had two Jewish parents and people who had one Jewish parent, and sometimes got out of being transported as a result, or didn't get transported until later. And that was how he connected with it. I've got the song here if you want me to play a little bit of it and sing it.
Yeah, just a short excerpt.
Okay. Jednou byla a kde se žila malá veška. Krásná pana, však pokana, ženská myška. Každý panáček, chtěl by byl miláček, veš fakt šišné, ti vedla přišné, tvoj srdcaček. It just keeps on going. And there's another little verse, but it's a fascinating little song, and the version that Jerry taught me had a different ending to the version that ended up in your book. So that was, that's
Which sounds like it was
that's our oral position.
Yeah, that version that didn't end up in my book was much more pointed about the kind of the racial aspects of the Nazi laws.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's what got me interested, and I was very excited when we won the grant, and I really wanted to do this out of all of the works that you had researched, because I thought this was going to be something that survivors would have connected with, particularly the music, because the music of Jaroslav Ježek was so universally popular among all Czech people, continues to be. So, I remember when you and I were in Prague in 2016, and we actually went to see a Voskovec and Verich and Ježek play together.
Yeah, the melodies are so durable, and I do encourage anybody who's listening to us now, like, get onto YouTube and just take a look at some of Voskovec, take a listen to Voskovec and Verich's work with Ježek, because this, and especially to have these kind of jazz melodies performed in a World War II Jewish ghetto, I know was quite stunning to some of our co-creators. So Joseph, thank you very much. Thank you. And next I'd like to ask Ian Maxwell.
Hello, Lisa.
Hi, hello. I remember you talking about what a surprise it was the first time that the actors heard some of this music. But I'd just like to ask you, if you'd like to comment on that, but also, how did you choose your performers, and how did they create the script from my very sketchy original outline, then the somewhat more fleshed out outline that you and Joseph and I created?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. Very quickly, I'm just going to take a moment to say that this work was created on the unceded land of the Gadigal people of Australia. For those of you not from Australia, it is quite conventional for Australians to acknowledge Indigenous ownership of land prior to public speaking. So I just want to put that up there. Lisa, when Joseph first came to me with this project and gave me the links to the music, it was the recordings on YouTube that, made me almost drop my coffee. It wasn't the music I was expecting to hear, and it was instantly intoxicating. So, and I think I got back to Joseph very quickly after that and said, yes, let's find a way to do this work. I work in a small department at the University of Sydney. We don't train actors, but we work closely with performers, a range of performers as artists in residence. So when we decided to go ahead with this project and we looked at casting opportunities, I guess I turned to the kind of people who had frequently been in residence in our department. And many of those people came from a performance scene in Sydney, which used to call itself the contemporary performance scene. A kind of broad genre characterized by physical performance, by what in some circles is called post-dramatic performance. Performance practices that are not reliant on conventional narrative, character, conventional dramaturgies, and who in very interesting ways resist notions of empathy and certainly resist notions of dramatic closure. So that's a kind of interesting aesthetic to work with. Also people who are had spent careers devising work rather than realising texts. So these were great people to work with. You, Joseph, and I did plump out a bit of a kind of narratological breakdown, slotting in the songs, finding plot points. And rehearsals actually started simply with us standing around a piano and working outwards from the music. I remember that very, very clearly. And as Gideon started singing, we kind of gestured to where a train line would be. And so this kind of cartography of Theresienstadt started unfolding. What was very interesting about casting those people were that 4 of the 5 casts were over 60 years old. And the remaining, the younger cast member, who was, I think, in his late 20s, was kind of an apprentice in this contemporary performance scene and emerged. And we quite arbitrarily, I think, in some ways assigned roles to people. We had 5 performers, about a dozen roles, and some things became quite obvious. And it became very clear straight away that the younger performer would be Prince Bedridden. We then I watched the extraordinary film, what's it called? Transport to Paradise, which was a kind of fictional documentary, extraordinary film shot in the 1950s by survivors from Theresienstadt, on location in Theresienstadt. And we started looking at some of the dynamics that were being shown to us in that film, some of which were about the young lads on the make in the township. And the thing that struck us, of course, was that Theresienstadt, although it wasn't a great place to be, as those figures indicated, wasn't a death camp. And the transport trains, which, as Lisa points out, in the lyrics that František wrote, there was this great ambiguity, this kind of knowing that they were going somewhere terrible, but holding out the possibility that they were going somewhere better than this. And critically, that these trains weren't going regularly. It was sporadic, which in some ways makes it worse, but also meant that time passed, that people were living in the city with a very uncertain relationship to the future. And I think we started playing with that and the question of being old and young in that context. And I'll just cutting to the chase, when we hit the end of the narrative we'd marked out, we sort of faced with a moment in which we couldn't work out how, well, certainly Lisa and myself, we couldn't work out how to resolve what was going on. And we sort of explored a kind of, there was another song we didn't use, the optimistic song, a wonderful song about the virtues of surviving and things getting better. And I must say that the cast felt very uncomfortable about going down that path. They felt it wasn't our place to, talk about the virtues of surviving when we couldn't possibly understand the circumstances in the same way that those who had been in those circumstances. And the cast proposed that what should happen at the end is that a kind of archetypal piece of contemporary performance staging, which is they reset the stage for the next iteration. And so we captured this notion of an older generation, perhaps quixotically, but relentlessly working to save a young person, and then having that young person possibly walking off to an uncertain fate. So we found this very uncomfortable, unresolved ending, which I think was actually very successful.
Yes.
So I guess, Lisa, the thing you didn't mention in recounting the plot.
Ian, I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Be extremely brief. Otherwise, we'll need to go forward.
Oh, no, just about the milk.
Yeah.
You didn't mention that before.
No, I didn't. We find out, but I'll revisit the very end of the plot when we go to the questions.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, Ian, thank you. Thank you so much. I just want to make sure we have enough time for all of our guests. Laura.
Hello.
There,
thank you so much for having me with you today.
Laura, I'm so glad that you could join us today. I would like to ask you about the students you worked with. So a group of undergraduate honor students watched the rehearsals of Prince Bedligen. So they saw this whole development process. And this is clearly a long distance in time for them. We're talking about the era of their grandparents or even great-grandparents. How did they respond to this work?
Thank you, Lisa. Yes, I was really keen to discover this too, because for many of us in the room, it was perhaps only one generation away. My father was a displaced person in the Second World War, but as you say, it was a lot further back in time, more than half a century for our students. They started by being interested in a kind of academic way. They'd been given the task of watching a rehearsal and writing up an analysis of what went on in the rehearsals. So they came to it from a course called Rehearsal Studies. But by being there every day, they grew closer to the material, not only through wonderful experiences of being able to meet Edith, the Theresian survivor, when she came to rehearsal, but also very much through what the performers were actually doing with their bodies in the rehearsal room. And Lisa, you and I have talked before about how some historians believe that there is a real historical value in doing reenactments. So like the Jane Austen balls in Bath, or the Americans getting dressed up in Civil War uniforms and playing out battlefield antics. And that we might laugh at that, but the idea behind it is a serious one. And it's the idea that culture is embodied. And so the practice of bodily activities from the past might actually function as a way of accessing or approaching that past and those past cultures. And theatre, of course, is the perfect way to do that. And we saw that emerging in the rehearsal room too. There was a wonderful moment that happened, I think, just after Nigel sang that song, the My Suitcase and Me song. And so it was just before he was to be sent off to get on a train to go to Auschwitz. And he turns and looks beseechingly at the king. And the king, in our production, very deliberately turns away from him. And in that tiny moment, everyone in the room had a very profound reaction. Ian, bless him, swore out loud. I went cold all over, and my students were talking about, well, one student in particular was talking about how her heart was pounding in her chest. So we all had this really visceral response, because in that tiny gesture by the actor, we had encapsulated all the people who turned a blind eye during the Holocaust, and all the people who had to choose who to save and who to let go in the Holocaust. And so in that embodied moment, we were viscerally kind of transported closer to the people of Theresienstadt. And I think that was a really remarkable discovery for the students who wrote about this very movingly in their casebooks for me. So I think that was the really extraordinary thing about being part of watching this rehearsal process, that really genuinely embodied sense of being able to move closer to people who and how they lived 3/4 of a century ago.
It was wonderful to have them in the room because, as I mentioned right at the beginning, so many amazing things happen in the rehearsal room that don't necessarily make it into the play. In this case, it did, and the audience was able to see that. But the effect in that moment of seeing it for the first time, I'm really glad that your students had that experience.
Me too.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
And now we'd like to talk to some of the creatives from the South African production, Amelda. Oh, excuse me. Let me see. Was Kevin able to join us? Kevin Hunt, the music director, was going to try. Kevin Hunt, the music director from the Australia. Kevin, hello.
Hello.
Hi. Oh, good. We can see you.
I'll be as brief as I
Yeah.
can.
Okay. I'll just ask you, could you just, like, we talked about several questions. Could you just answer one that you'd most like to talk about? And apologies, but please do be brief.
Yes, I was following on from Laura there, keen to talk about the students' experience because we're talking about quite young people and in quite a horrific time of history that I think they probably hadn't really thought about too much. And like we've been talking about earlier, that the JazzX music is so jazz influenced, and my students are all jazz players and studying jazz performance. And all these immediate things in their lives where they don't get experience working with actors, they don't get experience working in pits until they're, if they're lucky, if they're in the, it's very rare that they get to play for musicals. Actually, now I'm thinking about it, they do amateur musicals. But to work that closely, like Laura was just talking about in the rehearsal, with professional actors and with a professional director, and with historians like you guys, the researchers stitching it back together, what may have happened through the energy of song and melody, of JazzX melody, enduring a second, relevance from 1930s to now 43, whole different script, but the same sentiment is held in those melodies. All of these layers were too many for these young people. What we were trying to do is just play the dots. We just tried to get through playing the dots and to make it sound as much as a liberated theatre band might sound, where they're professional jazz musicians hired for a gig, and we're reading the dots, and then an actor says, "That's too loud," or we need this, we need that, we need this, we need that. The band's too much. Have a solo clarinet there, or we just want the piano. And so we did about 3 weeks rehearsing on our own, but then for those young people then to see it all, sometimes the carpet's taken from beneath them, they've got to make something up on the spot, like the actors were. Just a brilliant experience.
I'm so glad that we could have that live orchestra and that the students did have that experience, because even things like little incidental sounds that they added on your direction just enhanced the show tremendously. Kevin, I'm so glad that you could join us, and I hope that you can stick around just in case people do have questions about the music afterwards. Okay,
absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you. And now we'll switch over to the South African team. I'd like to welcome Amelda. Devanisha, maybe both of you can appear at the same time if that's possible. So Amelda Brand, the director, and Devanisha Schwartz, who was one of the actors. Unfortunately, I just got a message from Marella, another actor, that she's not going to be able to join us, but fingers crossed. I know Devanisha was having, there she is. Devanisha, hi. Oh, I'm so glad you could work out your video. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
And here is the question. Amelda, and well, you both have a lot to say about this. If you could talk about some of the conversations that you had about the use of humor. As you know, this is a really tricky thing to use in works about the Holocaust. So could you talk about the decisions that you made about the use of humor?
I'll start with a kind of overview, and then it would be great for Devanisha, who played Focus, I'm sure, to continue, and then also continue to do her honors research on the ability to play, or what we refer to the seemingly unplayable, to make that playable. But Lisa, you know, in the beginning, we also discovered that our student cast were quite close in age to the original cast. And for us, Petrus, you mentioned that Professor de Pree asked me in the beginning, oh, would I want to do a workshop production? And thinking, oh yes, as Ian mentioned, wonderful post-traumatic aesthetic, we can work with that. And as the material came, it was suddenly this realization of, okay, and we learned about liberated theater of Prague and what happened. And then we say, okay, there's people, it's review, it's musical review, they're joking about things, there's satire. And it suddenly was this thing, what's our permission? Do we have permission to play with this? And I think for us, what happened, and I will set this up, it was we realized we are going to take the invitation of the parameters of the form, the art form, being the liberated theatre of Prague, where there was permission to play with certain things. And what we then had to do is we demarcated things. We needed to demarcate, we refer to it as the fairy tale, where this is the imaginary world where you can play and have these kind of bigger than life characters where there's permission to play. And then also the setting of the ghetto that we had to do research about to understand. And then we had to be honest and we had to put ourselves there. Not to cover up or block the story, but it was for us the most authentic and honest way to engage with the material. And then we realized we had permission to start to play, because we also was in a position where we couldn't take ourselves too seriously, and where our own issues were also unmasked in the process. So when we could do that, that kind of opened up the playing part for us. And I think in this demarcation of the space, in the idea of staging, there was also this idea of witnessing. So it was a very specific thing about space and where we could play and what we could play about. And it just so happened that there was lots of witnessing happening and sometimes being immersed in the play and then also looking in and being part of it. And I'll leave it there.
Devanisha, could you say a few words about humor in the play?
Yes, so I had the incredible privilege of being able to play Pocus. And as Amelda said, like a lot of us we were close to the age of these characters, and realizing that in this dire space, as the actors in Theresienstadt, in this dire space, they were able to create something that just, I don't want to even say lighten the mood, but allowed them to settle into community, and the use of comedy then ended up being this way of kind of settling into community and being able to laugh about the serious, because that's what we do. I mean, as South Africans, we are very equipped in doing that, in taking the pain of what is happening in our society and being able to laugh at it, not because it's funny, but because it is a way to deal, and it is a way to examine trauma. So yes, so it being a workshop production, we went in and we wrote, we got to, I think we were also incredibly fortunate that we got a skeleton, and that because we had the skeleton, we could fill it with comedy. And we went in and oh my gosh, it was very long. It was a very beautiful, long process, but one that we as a cast felt so honored to be a part of. In terms of the demarcation that Amelda was speaking about, it was something that we went and we re-examined, but it was something as simple as removing the star. And what we found in our research was that when the star was, yes, the Jewish star, when the star was removed, you were just on stage as a person. And that for us was a beautiful segue into, okay, well, when we want to show that we are in the fairy tale world, we can remove the star because now it's just play. And still respecting.
I And that is historically true, that the Theresian
Yeah.
prisoners did not have to wear their stars when they were on stage.
When they were on stage, exactly. And so for us, we found that was a beautiful layer that we could bring in, and it gave us goosebumps the first time that we heard that, and that it almost gave us another sense of permission to play. And yeah, it's just such a privilege that we were able to delve into this work as students, as people who were in a space that helped us question society and helped us work with difficult material like that. And yeah, it's such a beautiful learning curve and yeah, an honor.
Lisa, just at the end, so if I may, because I think, and wrapping it up, what Devanisha mentioned, and I think you asking specifically about humor, and I think Devanisha mentioned it, and for us, that finding of now we can process, we can comment on things, we can process things, but as you play, we are also exposed. So it almost assists with that. And I think that's the beautiful, as she mentioned, that is something that is part of our South African kind of fiber as well. Using that, and with that comes parameters. What are the parameters within which we can play? And with that, what does it mean? And it's a terrible word to just overuse, but what does respect mean in this kind of term when we working with human material? Yeah, so I think that the vulnerability in play also comes to the fore when we work with humor. So thanks, Devanisha, you reminded me of that.
Thank you both. Thank you very much for joining us. And please do stick around in case people from the audience have questions for you. I'm going to ask my last question to Leonora Bredekamp, who was the music director for the South African production. Leonora, hello. Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, absolutely
Yes.
fine. And my question for you is, could you just speak briefly about maybe some of the key decisions that you made about the music for the South African production?
Yeah. Well, initially when I received the folder with the sheet music and also clips containing from the Australian production, I steered clear from listening to anything because I thought, let me see first what how the music speaks to me from the notation. And then we started rehearsing, and it was very clear that we had to transpose some of the music because of the student voices needed some lowering of the keys and so on. So we transposed some of that, and in the learning also applying it to the action on stage. Many of our tempi was completely different from what I expected the initial songs to be. So it was quite fast. So I also adapted some of the text, cut out a word or two just to make it more singable for the students while they are moving about on stage. And we really got to almost the end of the rehearsal process with only piano accompaniment. And I was very, very adamant to not use professionals in our case because it was a student production. And therefore, I also asked students from our department, I had to ask two professional players, the accordion player and the drummer, to join the group. But for the rest, it was all students who were taking part. The clarinet player was a student majoring in composition. So we had a workshop process also for the music, which I quite like workshop processes because I think everybody has something to bring to something. If it's not an originally composed piece of work, then it's open for interpretation. And also being from the archive, I always think if you're working from the archive, you're not going to be able to replicate something. You're bringing something from the now into the then. And it's just not possible to not bring your own interpretations or your own ideas about the other into it. And we were very conscious of that and also very careful and at sometimes apprehensive because we thought, are we appropriating? Are we putting some stamp of what we think the music would have sounded like? That I introduced a bit of klezmer sound into it with the instrumentation, not necessarily in the style of the music, but with the instrumentation. And it seemed to work in the end. And what happened was that all the players added something to the end result. And that was really wonderful to experience because The drummer, who was not, he's never played before for a stage production. He's always just played in bands and so on. He became the guy who was, actually binding scenes together with little things on the bells and so on, the bell tree and so on the drum kit. The clarinet player, he had this wailing sound that he could put in, and I don't know if you heard in the clip that you played, Lisa, there was a sort of leitmotif that sounded almost like a train, and that was something that was used on the accordion. It was replicated on the clarinet. It was done by a sort of a shuffle on the drums. So there was a lot of leitmotifs going that the musicians came up with during the rehearsal process. So my role was really to tie that all together and to make sure that everybody's creativity makes the show what it could be. But it was a fantastic experience for me personally. And I think for most of the students partaking in it as well, I think some of them had real experiences, especially also with the audience reactions that they spoke about afterwards.
I'm really glad that you and the students could be involved in that as musicians as well. And it enhances so much to have the rim shots and the kind of commentary from the drums and the clarinet. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
We have about 5 minutes left in case there are any questions from the audience. I'm going to pick up on something that Ian mentioned briefly, the question of the milk. I just showed you the first 4 steps in the plot. What happened after that was nobody was able to revive the prince. And a girl in the audience finally started crying. She starts weeping because she felt so sorry for the prince. And in the Australian production, the crying girl was actually played by Laura Ginter's daughter. It was an honor to have her involved. But the actors suddenly turned to this girl who was crying in the audience and told her, actually, don't be sad for the prince. This is a good thing. In fact, the king is intentionally keeping the prince ill. What's happening is he is bribing the wizard to inject the prince with milk. And what happens if you inject milk into someone's muscle is it makes you run a high fever. It makes you ill just for a few days, just enough so that you are not included on that outgoing transport. So for Theresienstadt, this was a happy ending. However, the ending for our creative team in Theresienstadt was not so happy. Joseph Lustig, who was the librettist, the author of the story, and also one of the main actors, died of an illness while he was still in the ghetto. František Kovanec was transported on one of these outgoing transports, as was Jiří Špic. You heard Joseph mention that one of the survivors that he later talked to met Jiří Špic, and he was actually still singing these songs even in later camps. František Kovanec perished. Jiří Špic did survive, even Auschwitz and a slave labor camp. He even survived that. Otto Neumann, the 4th member of the creative team, we just don't know what happened to him. So of all the people who were involved in this production, there was a handful of survivors who were able to quote certain moments from the show and give us some insight into the production in Theresienstadt. And based on these 3 things, the songs, that information from the survivors, and the poster, I'm tremendously honored and moved by the work that all of you put into these 2 productions that followed the same outline and honored not just the story from Theresienstadt, but the history. Both teams were so meticulous about the history, but yet breathed new life into this. So I just want to say thank you very much to all of you. We're almost out of time, but I'll thank everybody who tuned in today. The recording will be available, I believe, in a few days if anybody would like to watch this again. Panel members, please do click the backstage button so we can say a few words after the program ends. But just thank you everybody for tuning in, and please do buy the book.